Hello, my name is Larry Rizzolo. Thank you for joining me for this four-part series on social justice. The focus will be on zoning, affordable housing, and the public schools in Connecticut, and in particular, Guilford. To understand these hot topics, it's necessary to understand Black American history. Now, certainly the histories of Asians, Hispanics, and indigenous peoples are important, but they are beyond the scope of a four-part series. First, a little bit about my background. I'm not a historian or a lawyer or a politician. Just like you, I'm a concerned citizen who tried to educate myself so that I might advocate for social justice and vote intelligently at the ballot box. I would like to share with you what I've learned in the hope that it will inspire you to delve deeper into these issues and become an advocate yourself. By training, I'm a biomedical researcher who studied eye disease and taught anatomy at the Yale School of Medicine. I received Yale's highest honor for teaching and was a sought-after lecturer for explaining stem cell biology and eye disease to lay audiences. Since my retirement, I've been studying Black American history by reading Black authors, and I'm astonished by how little I was taught in school and how relevant it is to zoning and schooling, especially here in Connecticut. My source material will be shown at the end of every lecture. The organization Desegregate CT asked me to testify before the Planning and Development Committee of the Connecticut Legislature. They wanted me to talk about zoning and health disparities. I am currently a member of the Planning and Zoning Commission of Guilford. Here is the structure of the course. In the first section today, we'll discuss history after the Civil War that your schooling likely omitted. In the next session, we'll look at the racism that is embedded in housing policies and use a couple of case studies from Connecticut. Third session, we will consider some of the debates that were going on among Black American thought leaders during the post-Civil War period. And finally, we'll discuss education and race nationally, but honed down on the Guilford schools. I would like you to view this course through four lenses. Faulkner said, "The past is not dead, it's not even past." Let's consider this quote from James Baldwin. "Not everything is lost. Responsibility cannot be lost. It can only be abdicated. If one refuses abdication, one begins again." Let me unpack this a little bit. Baldwin believed the problems of race stem from the erasure of Black history. Being of goodwill, the white community, on learning this history, would better understand the plight of Black folks, and consequently, racism would end of its own accord. Of course, such progress has been frustratingly slow. Nonetheless, by his own writing, Baldwin loved this country and the promise of its founding documents. With each setback, he resolved to begin again. So what is the responsibility of white people? We're not responsible for the sins of our ancestors, but we have profited from them to accumulate generational wealth and power. How can we use that wealth and power to further social justice? We need to examine where racism might be embedded within us and learn from Black communities how we might partner with them. These activities will renew our resolve and help us to begin again. The third lens I'd like you to view this course is the clothing shop. Imagine walking into a clothing shop with wild, outrageous outfits that you would never wear. But go ahead, take one off the rack and take it into the changing room, because the changing room is a very special place. It's a place where you can take off your old clothes and they'll be very safe. and you could put on this new outfit and walk into the shop knowing that nothing is going to happen to your old clothes. Walk around, take your time, get the feel of these new clothes. Look at yourself in the mirror. If you like the clothes, you might choose to buy them. Otherwise, you could put them back in the rack, because after all, your old clothes are safe in the changing room where you can go back and put those on. The last way I'd like you to view this course is as a buffet and an invitation. See what you might choose to sink your teeth in. The four lenses, past as present, reflection and renewal, the clothing shop, and the buffet. Let's begin. So at the end of this course, this lecture, you should be able to explain how the courts undermined the promise of the Civil War amendments. You should be able to describe the successes and failures of Reconstruction. And you should be able to give examples of racial progress and pushback. Here's the lecture plan. We're going to tell the same story 3 times. First, we'll discuss the Reconstruction amendments. Then we'll discuss Reconstruction, an attempt at reparations. And we'll discuss some of the progress and backlash. We'll begin with the Dred Scott case in 1857, which justified slavery. Even though Scott and his owner lived for a time in a free state, Scott could never be free. Blacks, being lesser humans, benefit by being enslaved. This is the text of the Supreme Court decision. Blacks are lazy, untrustworthy, undeserving, uneducable. This was not a brand new articulation by the Supreme Court. This philosophy of blacks being lazy, etc., occurred from the time the first slave ships arrived. The original deal was that slaves would serve for 15 years, and then they would have their freedom. But as time went on and slaves became free and became competitors, successful competitors, the landowners said, this is not the way we want to do this, and they changed the rules and made slaves for life. In time, the soil was exhausted. Modern farming methods were not known. And when the land became less profitable, it happened that westward expansion, there was a lot of land in a belt of land in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, the so-called Black Belt. Black because of the color of the rich soil. And so there was a great demand for slaves in these newly tilled fields. And so on the East Coast, in Virginia, for example, slaves were bred. That is, the children of the slaves would be sold to plantation owners along the Black Belt. Like any good farmer, a few black people would be kept behind to breed yet more and more. And so money was made by breeding slaves. So how do you justify that? And so it was this attitude that we are providing a service for these lazy, untrustworthy, undeserving, uneducable people. We're giving them a purpose in life. We're feeding them. They're making productive labor. And indeed, they were an important part of the economics of the time. This is considered one of the worst decisions by the Supreme Court, and it was disregarded in northern states. The Civil War amendments were watered down to secure Southern votes. The Supreme Court still regarded Black Americans as inferior. Even though Dred Scott case was to be struck down, that rationale behind it of blacks are benefit from slavery continued. This idea that now slavery doesn't exist, blacks were lazy, et cetera, et cetera. they interpreted the amendments in a very restrictive way. For example, before the Civil War, if a slave escaped from the South, the laws were interpreted in a very liberal way that allowed slave owners to go into the North and recover their slaves. But here, in this case, the amendments were construed in a very restrictive way to favor whites at the expense of blacks. I should say white Americans and black Americans. After all, we shouldn't be describing people as an adjective. So for the remainder of this course, I'm going to try to stick to this principle of black people, black Americans, black citizens, and so forth. To make an amendment work, Congress has to pass enabling laws, laws that show how the amendment is to be applied. But all the enabling laws passed by the Republican Congress were undone by the Supreme Court. The amendments were said to be applying to federal laws, not state laws and not private businesses. Now, I'd like you to think about the question, what documents in American history ended slavery? Take a minute to think about it. Actually, this was a trick question. Some people would say it was the Emancipation Proclamation. You can't undo things that are written in the Constitution by a proclamation. You have to go through a process of amending the Constitution. And recall that the Constitution defined blacks as 3/5 of a person. And so Lincoln reasoned during the Civil War that the black slaves were helping the Southern cause because slaves were beholden to their masters and they had to do what their masters said, so that they had no choice but to support the Confederacy. So Lincoln reasoned that if he freed the slaves, they would no longer have to support former slave masters. Of course, this law would be difficult to enforce. And the other aspect of it was if you lived in a slave state and you were not actively rebelling against the United States, this law didn't apply to you. It only applied to Confederate states that were in active rebellion against the United States government. And so, as more and more states became freed, those slaves remained free. Texas was the last state where the slaves learned that they were not slaves anymore. And the Juneteenth holiday, which is now a national holiday, celebrates Texas learning that those slaves were free. But to end slavery for everyone, you needed an amendment. So the 13th Amendment ended most slavery, but criminals could be enslaved. Free or poorly paid labor, $1 or $2 per hour, produces over 3,000 products. You likely have some of them in your house. Here we see prisoners at work making clothing for the military. Now you might say the prisoners had a choice. They didn't have to become laborers for the prisons. But think about it. The prisoners would like to stay in the good graces of the warden and the prison guards. And they would like to have a little bit of money to use in the commissary. They would also like to have a good face to put forward in front of the parole boards. So they really didn't have a choice. During Jim Crow, minor offenses led to jail. For example, looking askance at a white woman. So this became a method of keeping Black people in their place, and even the slightest infraction, they became slaves once again. In more modern times, the war on drugs is an example of Black citizens being targeted for incarceration. Now, certainly there were white people that got caught up in this, but it was no problem. If we entrapped a few white people, if we can accomplish the goal of targeting Black citizens. For example, a white teenager from the suburbs caught with cocaine would get a slap in the wrist. But in the inner city, where they used crack cocaine because it was cheaper, we can give a penalty for crack cocaine that was far greater than the penalty for regular cocaine, even though physiologically there's no difference between the two forms of cocaine. So Black citizens being concentrated in cities where they're likely to get their hands on crack cocaine, it was easy to target them, and Black citizens were overly represented in the prisons where they could work as slaves. Now you might say, wait a second, these folks are being paid, but the prisoners are being paid, well, let's call them slave wages. These prisons made great profits off their slave labor. The slaves acquired a few dollars that they can buy things from the commissary for basic living items. But when their term was over, they weren't able to save an appreciable amount of money that would help them when they got out of prison. Well, you might argue that they're receiving an apprenticeship. But the interesting thing is, when they got out of prison and went to that industry to get a job, they were turned down. A, because they were felons. B, why pay them a living wage when they can get prison labor at much lower cost? The third problem was that when a felon was released, it was hard to get a job because they would always have to check this box that, yes, I was a felon. They were not eligible for any kind of state aid. If they went back to their family could no longer get state aid, food stamps, for example, or Section 8 housing vouchers and the like. And so they couldn't return to their families, they couldn't get a job, and it became all too easy to fall back into a habit of crime just to survive, and back to prison they went. Let's consider the 14th Amendment that said all that were born in the United States were citizens. This reversed the Dred Scott decision. They were entitled to due process of the laws. Everyone was entitled to protection of the law, even non-citizens residing within U.S. borders, which of course is important for immigrants. But, as we noted before, SCOTUS had a narrow interpretation that undid the enabling statutes passed by Congress during Reconstruction. In 1873, the so-called Slaughterhouse decision got the Privileges or Immunities Clause. Blacks could travel and petition the government, but the amendment doesn't apply otherwise to private citizens and businesses. In 1910, the Plessy v. Ferguson case justified segregations on railway cards. The Supreme Court thereby articulates the concept of separate but equal. Jim Crow laws negate most of the amendment. The enabling laws were restored in the 60s. Voter, Fair Housing, and Civil Rights Acts. Over the years, recent Supreme Courts are gutting these, beginning probably in the 1990s, more or less. Let's fast forward to Brown versus the Board of Education. It's actually a question about citizenship. Segregation kept Black Americans as second-class citizens. The courts blocked the massive resistance by the South. Consequently, the South became more integrated than the North, who didn't think that this case applied to them. 1988 brought in a more conservative Supreme Court, and integration has regressed. Let's consider the 15th Amendment. It underscores voting as a right of citizenship. In principle, the 14th Amendment would cover this, but here was a reinforcement of this fundamental right of citizenship. But again, to gain Southern support, the bill allows for disenfranchisement by way of requirements that are not explicitly based on race. For example, you can exclude someone on the basis of a literacy test, or a poll tax, or any of a variety of clever ways that did not explicitly say race to exclude somebody. So in 1877, the courts and Congress pushed back on male voting rights. Filibusters by the South favor voter suppression and lynching. Interestingly, Connecticut was the first in the nation to use literacy tests to disenfranchise Black citizens in local elections. Let's go back to the beginning and tell the story a second time. This would be our first attempt at making reparations, the Freeman's Bureau, and what became of it. The freed slaves had no land, money, or adequate education for the life they were about to enter. You may recall General Sherman. General Sherman was the fellow that marched across the South in a slash and burn program that burned down Atlanta on its way to Savannah. And this effectively divided the South in two and hastened the end of the war. General Sherman was put in charge of a strip of land along the Atlantic coast. And he asked the former slaves, he asked the Black community, what would be most helpful to you? And they said, we want land. And so General Sherman appropriated all the land owned by the slave owners and divided it up into 40-acre plots. This gave rise to the saying, 40 acres and a mule. The mule actually wasn't part of the deal. President Johnson, succeeding President Lincoln, didn't like this program because the Blacks would become dependent on the state. This was a reiteration of prejudice held from the beginning and articulated by the Dred Scott case. At the same time, there was the Homestead Act, which gave land to white people to encourage their Western migration. There was no concern that white people might become dependent on the government. Only Black people who, according to Dred Scott philosophy, were lazy, undependable, was the attitude. So the Freeman's Bureau had growing pains. It had its successes and its failures, as you might expect for a new program, especially one that didn't have the support of the federal government. It was underfunded, understaffed. President Johnson didn't support it. One of the successes, lasting successes, was it established thousands of schools, increased the number of historically Black colleges and universities. And I want to highlight two of them. One is Hampton College, because that was the alma mater of Booker T. Washington, who went on to found Tuskegee University. The other is Fisk College, now a university, which is the alma mater of W.E. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells Barnett. And among their accomplishments was helping to found the NAACP. These folks will be featured in the third session of this course. Another success was healthcare. The Bureau opened health clinics to fight a smallpox epidemic for the fear that this would spread to white communities. And again, President Johnson interfered lest blacks become dependent on the government. Rather than address poverty, Johnson tries to kill the effort, and this leads to ill health. Again, sustaining the effects of the Dred Scott case. Now, Reconstruction ended with a compromise. This gentleman you see is Rutherford B. Hayes. In his election to the presidency, the vote was tied. And to break this tie by getting Southern electors, Hayes promised to end Reconstruction. He removed the federal troops, and the Jim Crow era begins. Woodrow Wilson extended Jim Crow policies to his administration. He segregated all the departments in the executive branch. This leaves decisions regarding voting, civil rights, etc., to the states. In other words, no enforcement of the Constitution. Going back to the beginning once again, let's look at some of the pushback after modest progress was made by the Black community. And we're just going to give a few examples. The first one is the Colfax riot. This was a dispute over Republican Black electoral victory. Fearing white supremacists, the Black militia occupied the courthouse. The Ku Klux Klan killed the Black defenders, including those who surrendered. The Supreme Court overturned the resulting convictions. These were private citizens, not agents of the state. And you can see from this plaque, this event marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. So this was regarded, this memorial plaque, as a good thing, a success of the Confederacy or former Confederacy against Black citizens and their successes. In Wilmington, North Carolina, a coup d'etat by white supremacists deposed a duly elected slate of Black leaders. And finally, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which has gained a lot of notoriety recently, a Black Wall Street, a vibrant community with Black-owned businesses, theaters, banks, stores, everything you might want to be a self-sufficient community, and white deputies burned down the neighborhood. Let's look at another aspect of pushback. The Confederate statues were erected to reassert white dominance. Most of the statues were erected in two waves. These were not to honor Southern leaders who led an insurrection. They were to intimidate Black residents and push the lost cause myth. The lost cause myth was that the Civil War was a noble adventure to support states' rights and a way of life, and not over slavery. In fact, none of the articles of succession mentioned states' rights, except for Mississippi. But the articles of each state emphasized slavery. In the 1920s, with the 19th Amendment, Black suffragists were very active, which led to grandiose statues that were intended to reinforce Jim Crow. We'll talk about the Black suffragists in more detail later on. The civil rights legislation of the 60s led to the grandiose statues that were intended to rebel against civil rights. And you can see how huge this statue is, placed in the public square, placed where Black residents would see it every day, intimidating that they should stay in their place. Contrast this with statues to American leaders who advanced democracy. Now, it's true Washington and Jefferson and so on held slaves. And this was a flaw in their character, even though it was commonplace at the time. But look at the positive things these leaders did. A new philosophy, a new theory of government, and its noble principles on which the country was founded, principles that Black Americans would like to see lived up to today. By contrast, the statues to the Confederates were to honor secessionists who tried to destroy rather than create. So to summarize this first presentation, the Civil War amendments had loopholes that SCOTUS used to limit the rights of Black citizens and preserve the pre-Civil War order. This became slavery by another means. Despite strong resistance and a steep learning curve, the Freeman's Bureau had mixed successes until it was prematurely terminated. Perhaps its most lasting effects were the historically Black colleges and universities that it fostered. And finally, progress did not change the hearts of white America. Every step forward was followed by pushback. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you again for the next session, where we apply some of these principles to the problems of zoning and housing reform in America, and especially in Connecticut, and in particular, Guilford. I would like to thank Dennis Culleton from the Witness Stone Project, Joel Haylander, Guilford Town Historian, Errol Davis of the African American Heritage House in Chautauqua, New York, and Camille Borders, Princeton University, and the African American Heritage House, for their helpful discussions. Carol Rizzolo provided help and encouragement. Edwin Williams and Charla Nietzsche provided stories about New Haven's Dixwell and Newhallville neighborhoods. Special thanks to Tracy Tomaselli, the Historical Room in the Guilford Town Library, who provided research materials and helpful suggestions. Please feel free to contact me at larry.rizzolo@gmail.com.